Hello, welcome back. Today is going to be an interesting little video for you. I am spending a lot of time thinking about some different concepts and ways that we've interpreted the Bible, or even maybe had one position, and we really should have a balanced position instead of just one ideal. There's juxtapositions that happen in the Word of God. There's the balance that we see with loving your neighbor, but then also you have to have boundaries. You have to have justice if they do something wrong to you. You have to have this back and forth. It can't just be one way. And so you've got examples of God being swift in his love and rescuing someone out of a troubled time, but then he also shows his love in a different way, which is discipline. And so it's not one or the other. And this concept carries throughout the entire Bible. And it's really fundamental for us because we are in a day where there's so many that want to convince you that there's only one way to perceive facts. There's only one narrative. And this is very important for us to see, because maybe it's in their best interest to only have one narrative, especially if they're narcissistic. And there's so many conversations that I've been a part of and seen and witnessed that all tie into this word of narrative. And it's based on image, it's based on reputation and status. And anyone who lives for those things is willing to do anything to undercut, to deconstruct, to destroy the people around them for the sake of their identity, their perception, their reputation, or ultimately the narrative that feeds the underlying thing. And this goes into culture today. We see that if a corporate narrative gets spun off into one direction or another, then it could be dismal for the company. Well, this is obviously the way that words have been used and arguments have been used, ideas have been used throughout history. And we see this in the Bible, and we see it ever more present today. And I just kind of want to spend a few minutes talking about this. I feel like it's really fundamental for you and I to be aware of these biblical principles, but then the structure in terms of what to see and not get caught up in someone else's lie. So a narcissist would tell you that there's only one way to perceive this, and here's the way you need to perceive it. And then they would check you on what you may or may not know. And then if you don't give them the answers that they actually want to see or they want to hear, then they will regurgitate or reiterate in maybe 5 different ways the way that you need to perceive, the way that you need to understand this. And this is the world. These obviously manifest in individuals, but this is the world to you and I. And the best way they do that is they make sure that if you have a disagreeing narrative, that they're either louder, they overpower you, or they can kind of shut you down somehow. And this is their way to control the conversation. This is their way to control their identity, because to them, as I said, reputation is everything. It's the perception of who they are. And so it's not about who they are. That's not something we can talk about. But what we can talk about is the perception of who they are, because that's the only thing they care about. They don't want to change. They want you to believe they're a different person. And so this is present in so many different churches today. We see that the primary leader has these narcissistic traits, and they can't allow an alternative conversation to happen about whatever. Maybe it's balance, maybe it's health, maybe it's love, maybe it's relationship communication, maybe it's business, maybe it's, whatever. They can't have an alternative conversation because they only see it through their mind. They're not open to any other ideas. And so they live their entire life trying to convince you or sabotage you into believing what their narrative is, what their ideal is. And unfortunately, we have a whole group of people that have been taught to, be submissive, be honoring, be loving, be kind. Don't push back. Turn the other cheek. Listen to your leaders. All the one-sided conversations in the Bible have been pounded into us for submission, but the other side of those conversations haven't really been fundamentally taught and instructed. What do you do when you're in an abusive relationship? Do you continually turn the other cheek? What do you do when someone is telling you lies continuously? Do you just keep loving them and letting them lie to you? What do you do when I could come up with so many examples. Basically, the other side of the equation is life. Yes, we would obviously love to have these examples of every single person can just turn their cheek and let the abuser keep punching them in the face, and they smile and everybody's happy and we all move on with life, and wow, wasn't that a demonstration of Jesus? But is that exactly what God would want you to do? Not defend yourself, not protect yourself, not come up with a situation where you're not putting yourself in harm's way? We could come up with so many scriptures that tell you that you need to get out of that situation as fast as possible. Equally so, we could show you scriptures where maybe it's better for you to turn the cheek and, take the punch. But we need to see that there's two sides to this equation. And so the thing that comes to mind initially is, a word search on testing the words. And this is a biblical concept. So you can look at your scriptures. We got a few here. There's 8 or so words that directly tie into, 8 verses that tie directly into testing the words. If the words have been given, the one I love is in Job 12:11. Does not the ear test words and the mouth taste its food? Are you eating anything without tasting it? I mean, that's kind of a very simple concept, but let's think about this in terms of life and the conversations that are coming our way and what people say on the news and the narrative that's coming our way. Are you digesting and eating everything without tasting it? Do you have a standard? That's what I really want to know. With your ears, do you have a standard with what you're willing to listen to and how you test words? Or are you just taking anything that people say as truth and you have no way to test, or you don't really care to? If they're telling you something, then it's true. There's no test. So this premise here in Job 12:11 is actually extremely profound. Do you have an ability to test the words that are being spoken, the narrative that's being spoken? Are you asking the healthy and appropriate questions for your heart, with God, with the relationships around you, where you're not just taking anything as it pertains to food and just eating it and not caring how it tastes or what it's good, if it's good for your body? This same thing happens in culture today, where there's an argument or a narrative that's being spun or being told. And guess what? You're just supposed to believe it because you're naive and you won't test it. The majority of people won't do their homework in life. They won't test the words. They won't see if it's actually true. They'll just take the hearsay, or they'll take the narrative, or they'll take the article, and they won't actually do the work. That's why there's so much confusion about the end times, eschatology, and the second coming of Christ, and even prophecy and modern prophecy today, because people don't want to test the words. They don't want to test it. They don't want to do the homework. And that's why they get tossed back and forth with the waves. And that's why people are just getting canceled, because they don't want to test it. I'm not saying you can't cancel somebody for things that they do wrong. Sure, of course you can. But are you going to just take any random comment, any random conversation from somebody, and then just write somebody off without actually doing the Christian thing, which is, what kind of standard are you holding up? What kind of process do you have when you hear news about somebody? Are you willing to just adopt the new narrative without even actually testing it? What if somebody comes and tells you something about your spouse, and you've known your spouse for years, and they tell you some crazy outlandish thing about your spouse? Are you supposed to just believe it? You would say no. You have a standard. You're going to go and process this with your spouse. You're going to find out what the heck's going on. Or maybe you know, because you know your spouse, because you do have a standard that you've built up. You know the character of the person. You've spent times with them, intimate times. You spent wonderful times with them through the years, and you know they would never do something like that. Well, what do? You're going to run it through that filter. You're going to run it through that process. You're going to test the word. You're not going to just take it at face value and adopt this new narrative just because. Well, I would say that we're no less different than anybody else if we take whatever comes into our mouth and we're willing to eat it without questioning, or we take whatever comes into our ears and we're willing to listen to it without questioning. What are we? What are we if we're not just a garbage truck at that point? Standards actually create our Christian life. Standards create our healthy life on earth, but standards create our Christian life. That's what the Bible's all about. And the difference between the right and the left components, which is turn your cheek or actually have a strategy to avoid those situations or defend yourself. The difference between those two is relationship. It's knowing what to do within that situation. That's why the Holy Spirit's invited into the New Testament, is because you can have that active relationship and know which one you should be deploying. Because maybe, just maybe, it's not the time to turn the cheek. Maybe it's time to start defending yourself. Maybe it's time for you to actually take martial arts classes and fight back rather than just turning the cheek continuously. Maybe what God wants you to do is to get equipped to fight back next time, and not just take the narrative, not just take anything that people are feeding you as something you should eat, but you should taste it. You should have a standard for yourself. Don't eat all the free food that comes into your way. Have a standard for your body. Have a standard for your mouth. I know this is like elementary, but I want to tie it into the second principle here, which is the foundation of the Christian walk, which Jesus says. I'm going to just hop over to this verse here I pulled up. In John chapter 3, do not be amazed that I say this to you. You must be born again. And we've always thought, like, okay, I get this. This is an interesting concept. Being born again, that blew their minds, because it's like, yeah, do I climb back into my mom and then come back out? Like, what are you talking about? Let's just use this conversation as an example. The premise today in modern Christianity is that there's evangelism out there. You're told a story about Jesus, and that story should elicit a confession from you, right? Believe this, say this, confess this, right? So after you hear the story, you're supposed to elicit a confession, and then boom, you're saved. Boom, 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 it all happened. And the premise for that, I always thought like that was the case, because I went to different churches where they were very evangelistic in their model, and they were like, okay, the whole premise of this is just share the gospel. And then if you share the gospel, I've got a few other verses pulled up here. Let's see. Oh, here's one. Acts 8:4 I pulled up. Therefore, they were scattered abroad, and then whenever we're preaching the word. And then we've got a lot of invitations about, sharing the word, proclaiming the good news to the world. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with that at all. We want to proclaim the good news of the gospel to the world, but this take on it, this approach, I want to pick it apart a little bit. So God says, go share the gospel with the whole world. And then the modern day evangelist would say, okay, here's what we need to do. We need to have this buttoned up 30-second thing and then get them to do a prayer at the end. And then we got to package these 3 or 4 different ingredients in the prayer. And then boom, if they have a confession, then boom, we've solved it. And now they're saved. But let's go back to, John 3:7 here. But you must be born again. Okay, think about the process of being born. It's like you're being developed from the tiniest little speck for 9 months, where every single thing that you need in life is being given to you. And you're not even talking, you're not even walking. You are 100% dependent upon the life source. And this is the cultivated state of you being fashioned by God. And there will be one day where you present yourself to the world, but it's not today. It may be 9 months from now, or for some 10 months from now. And there's a huge amount of time where you're just receiving and growing. And then, when you're finally ready, you're birthed into the world where you're at a fully developed state where you can sustain life on your own, with God, of course, but on your own. You don't need that initial life source to be tied in order for you to breathe, in order for you to eat, in order for you to think. You have an autonomy that was designed by God. And so let's think about that for a second. The idea in the Christian walk is that, if you can just get a confession, just confess, just say the confession, then you'll be saved, then you'll be free. And the premise there is that you're actually transformed, and in that transformation, you're free. It's not just in words, obviously. I'm going back to the narrative piece. Yes, I want you to agree with the Bible here, but I want you to also see that your heart you have to transform. You have to change. The test is for you to see the transformation. It's not just to share the words. We don't want just people to share the words. We want them to actually be changed. That's the difference. So what's the difference between someone who has a confession and someone who's transformed? Complete different. Like totally different. They're not even the same person. Very, very, very different. Why do we see this in life? Well, it's easier just to get a confession, and then we can go rah, rah, rah. Look, we saved 10,000 people this week. We saved hundreds of thousands of people at this event. We did an event with 1 million people, and everybody said 3 words. Well, what transformation did we see? Were they actually transformed? You're like, well, God can do, I'm just planting seeds. You're like, okay, plant the seeds. But what's this must be born again process? Is this clearly isn't. Jesus took 9 months to be, fashioned in the womb before he came out. What is this process? How long does it take? Is there a process? That's the question. And I'm saying that even with the narrative conversation. Is there a process in which you take in information? Or do you just take it all in? You just become whatever you hear. It's all these people that sit in front of the TV and whatever news channel they're listening to. They become that. And you're like, wait a second. I can tell you've been listening to Fox News, or I can tell you've been listening to CNN, because that's what I'm hearing. Like, you just became that news channel. It's crazy. Well, this conversation, the confession ideal, goes into the narrative, because if I can get you to believe my confession, then it's a form of truth. And I would say there's much more under the hood. There's much more to this process than just whatever you can say to try to get someone to believe something from you. You have to test it. You got to know them. You have to go through a process in order to find truth. And anybody who's seeking out one particular narrative that has them the king of the hill, king of the mountain, they're always victorious, or they're always the perfect martyr, just know they're willing to do or say anything for the sake of their narrative, and they're willing to confess to any ideal that personally benefits them. And that's the difference with true biblical confession. It's a life transformed. It's a mind transformed. You don't even have to use the words. Thank you so much for joining me on today's little YouTube show. Look forward to seeing you again sometime soon.